Hi everybody, Steve Griffiths here, developer of the MTPredictor software program. Before we start today's video, I'd like to have a look at our risk disclaimer and just remind you all that all examples in these videos should be considered as hypothetical. They were not actually traded. That's not what we do in these videos. They are for training and illustration purposes only. Also remind you all there's risk of loss in trading and investing. All professional traders know that losses can and will and do happen. The trick is keeping the losses small. And all trade decisions are your own sole responsibility. Right, let's move over to have a look at an example that I was talking about in our MTPredictor training room yesterday. And I want to follow up on this because this was effectively a setup that I was looking at live actually just before it happened at the end of the webinar yesterday. So I want to follow up just to show you what happened after my comments yesterday. Now let's have a look at the situation. It was on the NQ, and what I was looking at was I first went out to a 15-minute chart and I placed a DP on the last pivot high, on this swing high here. So I was looking at this to be large term resistance. If we go down to the 3-minute chart, what I was actually saying, now again I want to stress I was actually doing this at the time, so I want to take our training mode back to as the chart was looking at the time. So the chart was about here when I was discussing this. So what I was actually saying was, because this was large degree resistance, you can see up here, the initial decline down here would have been considered a wave 1, and then what I suggested customers look for was an ABC correction. So I just want to double check the time on this. Yep, this was actually slightly earlier than this. It was just as the webinar was ending, it was 11:18. So just to this bar here was when I was making these comments. So in fact I'll actually take it back to exactly when this was actually going on. There. That's what the chart looked like when I was discussing it. So what I was actually saying that was, because this was major resistance, you can see here our MTP trend has gone grey. We had an initial decline down. Then I was looking for a potential ABC rally back up here into a potential wave 2. So what I'll do now is, I didn't do this in the webinar because I didn't have time because I was right at the end, but let's now look in advance of where a potential wave 2 or B would end. This is 2 mouse clicks, one here, one here. And you can see what I was suggesting was, if we had an ABC correction up into this level here, this could be an area where we could potentially be getting a holy grail short trade and the market could then move lower. So let's see how this unfolded, because it's always good to see how things happen or unfold after any comments made in a live webinar. So let's step forward and you can see this is exactly what happened. The market went up into this level here. It then started to decline down. If I turn training mode off, you can see it actually declined down quite nicely before we got a buy set up later in the day here, which wouldn't have been a tradable one because it's against a red MTP trend. So what's the conditions for a holy grail trade setup? Well, a holy grail trade setup is a major high, which is what we had here, an initial decline, an initial rally into the wave 2 or BWPT that subdivides into a minor ABC. So if I right mouse click here, do Elliott wave minor, you can see that's exactly what we got. Now why wasn't this as a automatic setup here? Well, it wasn't because the maths didn't quite come in together. It may have been because of the risk reward. However, this is why you have your scanner running, because if we now go down to a 2-minute chart, that's exactly what you got. So there's the same high. You can see there's the high at the DP resistance. Here's the initial decline down. Here's the ABC correction coming up into our holy grail sell setup. Remember, I was actually saying in advance, before this actually happened, that this is what customers should be looking out for when this particularly scenario is unfolding. Place the analysis on now. You can see this would have been our target, a potential 6.7 hour profit. Our position sizing kept our initial risk small under control, risking less than 2% of a sample $20,000 account. As you can see, you would have been taken in short here. The market moved sideways for a little bit. you wouldn't have been considering this buy setup because the MTP trend was red and it started to decline down nicely. Now I picked this example to follow up on because it didn't unfold as anticipated. I think there are too many software vendors who only ever show perfect examples. They only show examples that worked out in hindsight absolutely perfectly. But of course we know the market's not like that. We know that sometimes the market doesn't do what you anticipate, so it's a question of having a look and seeing what you could have done as a trader if the market doesn't do what you anticipate. But anyway, so far so good. You're in a potential holy grail short trade that you would have been preparing for in advance. In other words, you would have been waiting for this to happen, ready for it to happen. But what was happening now, as the market was declining down into this area here, which is about 1246, 1248, if you go back to the 3-minute chart, can you see how this was a TS3 buy setup, which wouldn't have really mattered anyway, but the important thing was this bar here was a high volume VS spike. Can you see this here? It's our red bar on our VS indicator here. This bar went down through this previous low. Can you see that? It then stopped and reversed. Now that was saying to me that particularly on this 3-minute time scale, the market was changing sentiment. In other words, the professionals were not looking to add short trades. They were actually looking to take profit on their short and potentially go long because of this VS bar here and then the failure to follow through, in other words, provide a reversal at this next bar here. So if the higher time frame chart, in this case the 3-minute, was giving you indication that professionals were probably now looking to move the market higher, what does that mean for you who are short on the 2-minute chart? Well, you can either take two views. Again, this is where MTPredictor is not a black box system where you follow everything blindly. It's a set of tools that different traders will use them in different ways. You may have just wanted to manage this on the 2-minute chart and have your stop to break even, which means you'd have come out with a break-even trade. You may well have looked at this and said, well, actually, I want to now follow this with our ATR stop because the trend here is going strong. In other words, it's gone through our grey band here. So you want to manage it with your ATR stop. So therefore, you take advantage if the decline would carry on. But if it didn't, you then stopped out with a 2.2 hour profit. Or you may be a little bit more experienced and saying, well, I've seen the VS bar come in on the 3-minute chart, therefore perhaps trail at the 1 bar highs, in other words, 1 tick above each bar high until it goes through that, and then look for it to carry on down into a holy grail target. But just in this particular point where the market's making a decision, bring your stop a little bit closer. If you'd done that, it would have been a 2.8 hour profit. So this is why sometimes it's difficult giving performance figures on MTPredictor, because each different trader, every single one of you is different. You're all individuals. You have different risk tolerances, you have different approaches to the market. So this is why MTPredictor is a tool set and not a black box system. But this is why I wanted to follow up on this particular trade setup. Firstly, because it shows you what unfolded after some comments I made in a live training webinar yesterday, and then also following up on a market that didn't unfold as anticipated. As you can see, it didn't go all the way down here to our typical wave 3 WPT. It stalled and started to go back up. But there were indications, particularly on the 3-minute chart, that the market was not likely to go further because of this high volume VS bar coming in at this particular area here. Also, I suggested that another reason why you might be a little bit careful on this particular trade setup, because on the ES at the same time, which was in around this whole level here, we hadn't reached our 15-minute DP resistance. So if the market had gone up into here, hit our DP resistance at this particular point in time, then backed off, the ES may have also added some selling pressure on, which would have put the market down, but because it hadn't reached its DP level, that was another reason to be slightly cautious about a continued decline on the NQ. The ES didn't reach its level till a lot later here in the day, around about 2 o'clock. So again, an indication of how more experienced traders could look at the different markets coming in together, particularly with the ES, because it's the what we call the boss, because it's the index of 500 shares, where the Nasdaq is only 100. So anyway, I hope that's been a good example to show a trade setup that's unfolded very nicely after some comments I made in yesterday's webinar, and to show you how to manage it when it didn't unfold as anticipated. But either way, I think you should have had a nice small profit coming out of that particular trade setup, and it was nice to see that trade unfold exactly as anticipated.